Hello and welcome to another installment of Stigma-Free Learning Live with the Stigma-Free Society. My name is Samara Liberman and I am the host of this bi-weekly Facebook and YouTube live event with the Stigma-Free Society. I'm going to assume that some of you are new here since this is a very new event to the Stigma-Free Society. So before we dive into the content for today's live event, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background on me and on the Stigma-Free Society so you have a little bit better of an understanding of what brings us all here today. So, as I said before, my name is Samara Liberman. I am the Programs Manager for the Stigma-Free Society. So a bit of a background on me is I have a bachelor's degree in equity studies, I have a master's in teaching, and I have a professional development certification in early years mental health. I am also the creator of the lesson plans that are housed in the Student Mental Health Toolkit, which is where we will be pulling from for today. So I'm really excited to talk you through some of the lesson plans that I've written that we have in the Student Mental Health Toolkit that you as a teacher can use in your classrooms to educate your students on different forms of stigma and how those forms of stigma intersect with mental health and with mental health stigma. So before we dive into the lesson, I'm just going to give you a bit of context on the Stigma-Free Society. So SFS is a decade-old Canadian registered charity that works to eliminate stigma of all kinds with a focus on mental health. So one of the primary ways that we work to do this at SFS is through education. And that's where these lesson plans come in. We firmly believe that education is one of the most effective ways to reduce and eliminate stigma. So I've created lesson plans on all different kinds of stigma, with always touching back to that mental health piece. So for the lesson plan that we're going to dive into today, we're going to be doing the Understanding Learning Disability Stigma lesson plan, and this lesson plan is intended for grades 4 to 7. So if you are an educator in any of that age bracket in BC, then this lesson plan is perfect for you. It is aligned with the BC curriculum in the areas of health education and visual art. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this lesson because this is one that is very near and dear to my heart. I have 2 learning disabilities. I have dyslexia and I have dyscalculia. And growing up, I had a lot of internalized stigma around my learning disabilities. I really struggled with them when I was younger, and now I am very, very vocal about talking about those learning disabilities and how they've impacted me educationally and professionally and how they continue to impact me. And I'm also very vocal about how they've impacted my mental health. So when I was starting to create the lesson plans for the Student Mental Health Toolkit, I knew that this was going to be a topic that I needed to cover as it's very personal to me. And I really want, students who are in a similar position that I was in when I was their age to feel like they have somewhere that they can go where other people are learning about their experience. As I say in this lesson, I think one of the best ways to understand other people is to learn about them. And, learning disabilities are something that we don't all experience. But for those of us who have it, it can be a really challenging thing to overcome. So we're going to dive into the lesson. If you would like to follow along, you will find this lesson plan in the Student Mental Health Toolkit on the Stigma-Free Society website. And again, the title of the lesson is Understanding Learning Disability Stigma, and it's in the grades 4 to 7 range. So I think it's really important to start off this lesson remembering that I think when we think about disabilities, we often think about physical disabilities and visible disabilities. But, it's a learning disability is a disability, but it's an invisible one. And it's one that we don't see that somebody has right away when we meet them. And that can be, a bit of a mixed thing for some people and for some of your students. I'm sure, it might be nice that it's not something that they have to carry with them and is very visible and is kind of written all over them. But it can also pose a challenge where they might experience challenges that they face very internally, and asking for help might be a lot more challenging given the fact that it's not very knowable to a lot of people. And in order for somebody to know that somebody has a learning disability, you have to be willing to disclose that. So it can create a lot of necessary vulnerability that can be really, really challenging. So this lesson plan is really intended to normalize the experience of having a learning disability for your students. And really, it's more intended for your students who don't have a learning disability than for the ones who do, because the ones who do will understand this experience, and the ones who don't might not, and that might create some stigma and misunderstanding around what a learning disability is and what it might be like for someone who has one. So in order to facilitate the reframing active component of this lesson plan, which is the art activity, your students are going to have the opportunity in that component of this lesson to look at the idea of reframing. So I think when we're looking at a learning disability, it can be really easy to get stuck in the idea and of what we think a disability is and what it looks like and how it manifests. But in this reframing activity, I really want your students to see how it's not always black or white, and the term disability is not always effective. I think the term diverse ability is more empowering way to look at a disability or a diverse ability, because I think while people with a learning disability might be held back in some ways, in other ways our brains are opened up to so many different possibilities because of the things that some people might see as an impairment, but it's not always the case. So we're going to dive into to the body of the lesson now. So before you watch the video that's in this lesson with your students, I'd like you to get them to start thinking about what they already know about learning disabilities. They might be coming into this with a lot of knowledge. Maybe they have a sibling who has a learning disability, or a friend who has a learning disability, or maybe they have one themselves. I think it's really good to get them thinking about these things and the things that they already know before they really dive into the lesson. So the video that you're going to be watching with them is specifically around the experience of dyslexia, but there are a lot of other learning disabilities, and I would like you to get your students to think about the ones that they know about. They might learn from each other in this part of the activity. Maybe they'll learn a new term or a new learning disability that they might not have known about before. So the video in this lesson is really intended to begin the discussion around the idea of what a learning disability is and how people with learning disabilities think and their experiences. So through watching this video, your students might already begin to reframe the way they understand learning disabilities. That's kind of the goal of this, is for them to start really thinking about it and seeing it differently. So once your students have watched the video, you can start a discussion with them around what they know about learning disabilities, now having watched the video, and if that's changed from before, and what they know about dyslexia now that they might not have understood before. So then, some of the questions that you might start asking them to spark this discussion is really to get them thinking about their understandings, their conceptions, maybe their misconceptions around learning disabilities and dyslexia specifically. So the question, what do you think of when you hear the word dyslexia, is really intended to tease out their preconceptions or their possible judgments around somebody who has a learning disability or who has dyslexia more specifically. So I think it's really important to note that if you have students in your class who do have diagnosed learning disabilities, or are getting tested, or who you suspect might have a learning disability, it's really important to facilitate a conversation where they feel safe. I know, as somebody who has a learning disability myself, talking about these things can be quite challenging, and I definitely don't want your students who have a learning disability to feel like they are being judged in this conversation. So I think as the teacher, it's really important to ensure that you have this safe space in your class and there's mutual trust and respect amongst your students before you start having this conversation, so that everyone feels respected. So in order to track your students' learning, I'm going to suggest that you write down different comments that are important on the board. And this will also act as a really great reference point for their exploration of reframing and understandings of learning disabilities that are going to continue throughout the remainder of this lesson. So start talking to your students about how stigma and around learning disabilities can occur. Generally speaking, stigma really exists when there's something that we don't understand and can't relate to. So, for someone who doesn't have a learning disability, they might not understand what that really looks like and how, there's a range of ways that people are impacted with learning disabilities. It can be academically, socially. I know for me, it really comes into effect when I'm with my dyscalculia, when I'm, trying to get from one place to another. Like, I have a lot of difficulty with directions, and your students might not know that that's a component of a learning disability, and they might kind of, have a lot of questions or have a lot of judgments around people who really struggle with directions. And it might be really interesting for you to give them that example of, it's something that might be so mundane for you, but it could be a real big challenge for somebody with a learning disability. So really starting to get them thinking about the different ways that people are impacted by their learning disabilities and how, it's important to not judge people for the things that they are struggling with. So before you begin the activity, or before you begin explaining what the activity in this lesson is going to be, I really want you to hone in on the concept of reframing. So in the context of this lesson, reframing I've defined as changing our perspectives on something to a more positive understanding of that thing. So in the body of this lesson, they're going to be able to do that by taking one object and turning it into another. So that's not necessarily taking a bad thing and making it good, but it's really showing them that, we can start with one idea of what something is and shift it into something else. So before you continue on with this lesson, I really want you to ensure that there is an understanding of what this concept means, as it's really going to ground the rest of this lesson. So you can ask follow-up questions and facilitate a discussion to really make sure that they have a deep understanding of this concept before you move on. I would definitely recommend doing that. So the active component of this lesson is an art activity. So to begin this portion of the lesson, you can pull up the examples of the different art pieces that your students are going to recreate but make their own. So I found a few websites where there are examples of art pieces that have been created by artists of one object that kind of morphs or changes or turns into something completely different. And that's what your students are going to be doing for this art piece. So you can show them these examples and get them to start thinking about what they might want to do for theirs. They can pick any objects they want. They can be as creative as they want. They can use any art materials that you have in the classroom or that they want to use or they feel inspired by. As long as it aligns with this concept of reframing. And I would encourage you to make sure that the objects that they're using are appropriate and that they really focus on this concept that we're trying to hone in on for this lesson. So give your students as much time as you think that they need to create these art pieces. This is supposed to be just like a fun exploration of this idea. And as they're creating their art pieces, I would recommend that you get them to think about, how this does connect to the idea of learning disabilities and reframing their understandings or their preconceptions or their judgments around what people with learning disabilities are capable of. Because, like I said earlier, and, like it's highlighted in the video, learning disabilities can unlock so many cool things in people's brains, and there's so much skill and so many assets that come along with having a learning disability. So I really want your students to start thinking about that as they're also creating their art piece. So after their art is made, you can have them talk about their pieces, share their pieces with each other in any way that you see fit or you think is best for your students. So this could be, sharing them in pairs or with the entire class or with just you if they might not want to share with everyone. Or you can do a gallery walk. So you could you could put the students' art up around the classroom and they can go around and look at everybody's art pieces one by one. You could even have the students stand beside their art piece and explain what it is to the other students as they're walking by. I think that's a really cool way to really showcase what they've created, and it might really give them the opportunity to learn from each other as well. And I just think that there's so much value in students sharing what they've created, especially when it comes to art, as it is so subjective, and you can see something in someone's art piece that they might not even have seen. So I think definitely give them an opportunity to share their art pieces. It doesn't have to be in a gallery. Like I said, it could be in more of a one-to-one interaction if that's a better fit for your class, or they could come up in front of the class and share their art piece, however you think that is going to be done best for your students. But really, I would give them the opportunity to share, because I think some really cool conversations can come out of that dialogue. So as the last piece of the lesson, I would encourage you to facilitate a whole group, a whole class discussion around the activity and the creation of these art pieces. And this is an opportunity where you can tie all of this stuff back into the idea of mental health stigma. So, I think the idea of reframing is very applicable to our understandings and our conceptions around learning disabilities, but it's also really important to think about it in the context of mental health stigma. So, as I said earlier, stigma exists around things that we don't understand, and for your students who've never experienced a mental health challenge or a mental illness, they might not understand it and they might be fearful of it, and that can create stigma. So this is really an opportunity to discuss with your students how stigmas of all kind exist, and in order to eliminate stigma, it's important to reframe how we see these things that we might not understand, and to learn about them and to learn about other people's lived experiences. So yeah, I would definitely encourage you to have that bigger conversation around stigma in general and mental health stigma more specifically, as it ties into the concept of reframing and as it ties into their art pieces. So that's the end of this walkthrough of the Understanding Learning Disabilities Stigma lesson plan. I hope that you found this to be helpful and that you now feel more equipped to implement this lesson with your students. I'll be back next week to do another walkthrough of a lesson plan for you, and that will be for the high school students. So if you are a teacher in the older age group, come back next week and you can learn a little bit more about a lesson plan that I've created for the high school students. Thank you so much for tuning in. I've really enjoyed talking you through this. As I said before, this is a lesson that I feel very passionately about, as it's something that directly impacts me, and I'm sure it impacts a lot of your students too. I think, whether they have a learning disability or not, or they know someone with a learning disability or not, it's a conversation that's really important to have, because like I said, it's not a visible disability, but it's there and it impacts people who have it, and it's really good to start that conversation with your students. So thank you so much again. My name is Samara, and if you have any further questions about the lesson you learned about today, you can always contact us at the Stigma-Free Society. You can contact me directly. You can ask a question in the chat, and I'm always happy to answer. So thank you so much.